Tinkaton should be a top-tier threat. It isn't. Here's exactly what needs to change. And at level 3, it becomes genuinely illegal.
Fairy Steel typing. Only 2 weaknesses. 105 special defense. A signature move at 120 base power with perfect accuracy and 0 self-debuffs. On paper, this thing is built to compete. In practice, it sits in an awkward middle ground where it's hard to justify over better options. That's the problem we're solving today. 3 levels of buffs. Level 1 carves out a niche without breaking anything. Level 2 makes it a real competitive threat. Level 3 is fully theoretical and makes Game Freak's balance team have a bad week. Each level carries everything forward, so by level 3 you've got the full stack. Before getting into the buffs, it's worth being precise about what's actually holding Tinkaton back, because the answer isn't obvious when you first look at the stat line. The attack stat is 75. That's the core issue. For a physical attacker that's supposed to threaten things with a 120 base power move, 75 attack is genuinely low. To put that in perspective, Cinccino sits at 95 attack, and nobody is running Cinccino in serious formats. Tinkaton is trying to threaten a meta full of bulky Pokémon off an attack stat that Cinccino outclasses. Then there's the Gigaton Hammer restriction. You can't use it on consecutive turns. That sounds manageable until you realize what it actually does to your decision-making. Every single turn after you click Gigaton Hammer, your opponent knows with certainty that you aren't clicking it again. That means they have a free window to pivot in a check, set up, or do whatever they need to stabilize. A 120 base power move that telegraphs a guaranteed safe turn to your opponent is fundamentally less threatening than a 90 base power move with no restrictions. The restriction doesn't just lower damage output, it removes the psychological pressure that high base power moves are supposed to generate. Coverage is the third layer of the problem. Play Rough and Gigaton Hammer are solid dual stab, but anything that resists or ignores both of those types just sits in front of Tinkaton and does whatever it wants. Brick Break and Bulldoze are on the move pool, but with 75 base attack, those moves are dealing damage numbers that most defensive Pokémon shrug off without a second thought. So Tinkaton ends up in a position where it's threatening into a specific slice of the meta and nearly irrelevant against everything outside that slice. Mold Breaker is legitimately good and does real work in specific matchups, but it's propping up a Pokémon that needs more structural support than one ability can provide. Level 1. Knockoff. Tinkaton's Pokédex entries in both Scarlet and Violet describe a Pokémon that actively steals whatever it wants and hauls those stolen goods back to wherever it lives. That is not a loose thematic connection. That is the exact mechanical description of what Knockoff does. You are removing an item from the opponent and keeping them without it for the rest of the match. The move was designed for a Pokémon that acts exactly like Tinkaton does in its own lore. The fact that it doesn't have Knockoff is a genuine oversight. From a competitive standpoint, Knockoff is consistently one of the highest value moves in any format it exists in. The ability to pull an Eviolite off Dusclops, remove a choice item from something that becomes dramatically less threatening the second it's locked in, or strip a heavy-duty Boots from a Pokémon that relies on hazard immunity to function. That's utility that translates into actual game states. Tinkaton doesn't need to be doing massive damage with Knockoff for it to matter. The disruption alone justifies the move slot. Knockoff also has real base power. 65 base, but effectively around 97.5 against any Pokémon holding an item, which in competitive play is nearly every Pokémon nearly every turn until the item is gone. Mold Breaker adds a niche layer on top of that, where Tinkaton can strip items from targets that other Pokémon can't cleanly threaten, depending on the ability interactions involved. What I like most about this as a level 1 change is what it doesn't require. You don't need to touch the attack stat. You don't need to change any abilities. You're handing Tinkaton a move that plays directly into its existing identity as a disruptive support presence, and giving it a way to generate real utility that its current kit is missing. That's a conservative buff that creates a concrete competitive niche without turning it into a meta-defining threat. This is exactly the kind of change that's easy to justify and hard to argue against. There's also a funny dynamic it creates with corviknight, which I want to address more in a moment, because those two have a relationship in both the lore and in team building that's worth unpacking. Level 2. Swords Dance. Everything from level 1 carries forward. Now we're adding Swords Dance to the equation, and this is where Tinkaton starts to actually scare people. The 75 base attack is the ceiling on everything Tinkaton wants to do offensively. Swords Dance removes that ceiling in specific situations. At +2, an adamant Tinkaton running a life orb is operating with an effective attack output somewhere around 220 before you even apply the base power of the move it's clicking. A Gigaton Hammer in that state is producing damage numbers that are going to one-shot or clean two-shot, a significant portion of the meta. Play Rough at +2 is threatening Garchomp and Como-O, which are exactly the kinds of physically bulky Pokémon that would normally sit comfortably in front of Tinkaton without much concern. Knockoff from level 1 fills the restricted turn after Gigaton Hammer with a move that has functional base power and generates item removal pressure simultaneously. The checks at this stage are real and accessible. Tinkaton's physical defense is 77, meaning setting up is a genuine risk every time you attempt it. Any team that's running Garchomp with Earthquake, which is most teams, already has a functional answer to Tinkaton's setup plan. Heatran covers the fire weakness and is one of the most common defensive pivots in any format where it's legal. Chi-Yu and Roaring Moon with Flare Blitz are both things you'd realistically see, and both things that make Tinkaton's game plan significantly more complicated before it gets off the ground. This is the level where Tinkaton becomes a legitimate threat that requires some respect in team building without dominating the meta. It has a real game plan. The game plan has real counterplay. That's the balance you're looking for in a level 2 buff. Now the corviknight conversation. Tinkaton and corviknight are genuinely competing for the same steel-type support slot on a lot of teams. The Pokédex entry for corviknight in Scarlet and Violet actually acknowledges this directly. It states that corviknight stopped offering taxi services in Paldea because Tinkaton has been launching rocks into the sky to knock corviknights out of the air. The competitive rivalry mirrors the lore rivalry in a way that's satisfying. With the level 1 knockoff edition, I think Tinkaton starts winning that comparison more consistently than it currently does. Corviknight doesn't have knockoff either, and Tinkaton would suddenly be offering item removal on top of comparable defensive utility. That's a meaningful differentiation point that didn't exist before. Tinkaton's non-mold breaker abilities are almost entirely ignored in competitive discussions, and honestly, they deserve a brief mention because one of them gets significantly more interesting with the knockoff buff. Own tempo, blocking confusion, is doing essentially nothing in modern formats, since swagger strategies have been irrelevant at high levels of play for years. Pickpocket, as the hidden ability though, creates some genuinely entertaining edge case interactions once Tinkaton has knockoff. There are specific scenarios where an opponent hits Tinkaton with a contact move, Pickpocket triggers and pulls their item over to Tinkaton, and then Tinkaton can use knockoff to remove a different item on the next turn. Neither Own Tempo nor Pickpocket is replacing Mold Breaker in any serious build, but the Pickpocket interaction adds a small amount of personality to Tinkaton in formats where creative sets have room to breathe. Level 3. Remove the consecutive use restriction on Gigaton Hammer entirely. That restriction is the entire reason Gigaton Hammer is considered a balanced move right now. The raw parameters on Gigaton Hammer without the restriction, 120 base power, 100% accuracy, no recoil, no stat drop, no secondary condition, are the same parameters that Origin Pulse and Precipice Blades operate at. Those are the signature moves of Kyogre and Groudon. The trade-off that makes Origin Pulse and Precipice Blades balanced for cover legendaries is that they have 80% accuracy. Gigaton Hammer has 100% accuracy. The restriction is doing the work that the accuracy drop is doing for the legendary signatures, and once you remove it, you're looking at a move that is objectively better than what Kyogre and Groudon are working with, on a Pokémon that can also set up with Swords Dance and strip items with knockoff. At +2, with an unrestricted Gigaton Hammer available every single turn, and knockoff as the secondary option for utility and supplemental damage, opponents need a hard answer to Tinkaton built into their team before the match even starts. Neutral targets at +2 off an Adamant Life Orb, Tinkaton are getting one-shotted or clean two-shotted depending on their bulk. The fairy coverage from Play Rough at +2 covers the things that Steel doesn't threaten as effectively, so the type combination that already only has 2 weaknesses is now generating offensive pressure across nearly the entire type chart. What makes this interesting as a level 3 option, beyond just the raw numbers, is that removing the restriction feels completely consistent with what Tinkaton actually is. Every part of this Pokemon's design, its visual identity, its Pokédex entries, its lore, its competitive identity, all of it centers on the hammer. The hammer is Tinkaton. Making Gigaton Hammer fully spammable is the most extreme possible version of what this Pokemon already wants to do, and it turns that identity into something genuinely threatening, rather than a gimmick with an asterisk attached. And here's the thing about the damage math at this level that I want to be specific about, because I've seen some calculations floating around that I think are underselling how bad this gets for the opposing team. A+2 Adamant Life Orb, Tinkaton clicking, Gigaton Hammer against a neutral target with average bulk isn't just threatening a one-shot. It's threatening a one-shot on things that would normally be considered checks. Pokemon that run into this and aren't specifically built to absorb it are getting removed in 1 or 2 hits, regardless of their general bulk stat, because the combination of +2, Life Orb, 120 base power, and Mold Breaker bypassing ability-based resistances is stacking multipliers in a way that most Pokemon's bulk stats simply aren't designed to absorb. The fire and ground checks still exist at level 3. They're just under dramatically more pressure because Tinkaton can remove items from them on restricted turns, and because you need to be bringing them in before Tinkaton is set up rather than after, since after is too late. The decision window for counterplay shrinks significantly compared to level 2. And in formats where Team Preview exists, opponents are now forced to dedicate a slot specifically to answering Tinkaton before they even know if you're running it. That's the part that makes level 3 genuinely broken rather than just strong. It's not that Tinkaton wins every game, it's that every opponent has to dedicate a team slot to answering it before they even know if you're running it.